This is Channel 4. Now the 11th hour presents a documentary which pits the arguments of the road lobby against those of the man in the street. Road Movie.
A heavy goods vehicle has broken down right in the middle of the junction of the A5, that's Cricklewood Broadway and Chicheley Road. Still care required at the M25 M11 interchange where there's a lorry overturned on the southbound slip road. Traffic is getting past slowly by using the hard shoulder and the near side lane.
And the Blackwall Tunnel is blocked in both directions. There's an accident in one bore and a broken down heavy goods vehicle in the other, so whichever way you're heading you're going to get held up here.
Shopkeepers both in Barnes and on the North Bank are asking for their rates to be reduced until the bridges reopen to traffic, after a juggernaut lorry snapped an arch bearing despite a 12-ton weight restriction.
No train cancellations, still, so far, and from London, transport and all clear on the buses and tubes. So now for air travel news, over to Trevor Ainsley.
And on the airways, travel to domestic and continental destinations is going well this evening, with no weather problems reported. British Airways flights from Europe are expected Heathrow on or close to their scheduled times. From further afield, New York, the first Concorde and BA 178 both heading in on time. Trevor Ainsley, air travel news.
It's 5:32. In the southeast, British Rail have announced plans to permanently close Broad Street and Dalston Junction stations. The prospective move comes as a part of BR's moves to divert services to Liverpool Street Station. However, a public inquiry is to be held into the scheme before any decision is made finally.
British Rail have turned their huge losses of 1982 into a comfortable surplus, and the BR chairman, Bob Reid, has praised railmen for their efforts in helping achieve that turnaround. But BR say to fulfil promises made to the government, another 14,500 jobs must go on the railways over the next 3 years to add to the 39,000 already lost.
All over Britain, 38-ton juggernauts join millions of cars thundering through our cities, towns and villages. Their destructiveness and their numbers are growing every day. Motorways are offered as the only solution. But residents in North London have been fighting juggernauts and motorways at successive public inquiries for over 15 years. The notorious Archway motorway scheme has become the national battleground for the future of transport planning and its effects on our society.
it's very disturbing. I've lived here for 20 years, over 20 years, and it's increased considerably since I first moved in. It was noisy then, but it's got a lot noisier. And even at the beginning, we never lived in the front. Always slept at the back. If you're sitting in the front room, sometimes you think they're going to come through your front room. As a matter of fact, I've had them through here once or twice. I don't know whether you noticed, there's 3 or 4 of these walls have been rebuilt all along here. Because if they're starting to move this way on a wet day or a skiddy day, in they come. So all of these houses here have had all their things knocked down. So really, the answer is to stop the traffic coming through. Not so much to rebuild the road, but it's useless trying to make a throughway here to a bottleneck at the bottom. So, you know, to my mind, the planners are so bloody stupid that they're going about it the wrong way. Now, that's my opinion of it all.
I stand to lose my house completely if the road is built.
Really?
Yes, because the slip.
In the path of the new road?
Yes, it's in the path of the slip road.
So you'll be going on to the inquiry?
I've been to every inquiry so far. Unfortunately, the inquiries are not reported exactly as people say.
As far as I can see, all they want the motorway for is for the bigger lorries to come on. Well, you're back to square one as far as I can see. This used to be quite a decent little shopping centre here, but, well, as you can see, it's nothing now.
Well, fundamentally, it comes back to the fact that you put the threat of a road line on the population. Any subsequent generations living on that, in that area, or wishing to live in it, have got to raise money. And they raise the money by going to banks or building societies and borrowing the money. And the collateral is a piece of land that may end up a motorway, because a road line is on it. And hence they can't raise the money. That way you take away the people because they can't live on it. Not everyone wants to be a squatter, and therefore most of the property becomes derelict. It's quite simple. It's a good system for those that want to build a motorway.
So it's just like here. It's a death trap. How many children have been killed? How many people have been killed, especially elderly people? They're only getting about 10 seconds across the street there, you know. And some of these juggernauts, they just want to beat that lights all the time. They're not prepared to stop. And that people's come out from behind one and been killed by one beating the light to the other side of it. That's how there's 3 people been killed there.
Accidents like this all the time on this?
All the time we have for Easter we have 6. Easter time, 6 accidents we have all in one day. It's too much. You sit in there, look at television, you are vroom. You look outside, accident. It really is too much in this road.
The number of accidents has got worse. I mean, it wasn't too bad to start with when we moved in. It's just increased beyond a joke.
Particularly after it started raining as well. You know, the surface is really bad. I mean, you can see the damage it's done to the walls, and it's not just that. There's some that have just spun round the road.
Well, we didn't have a wall before the last accident anyway. That had been knocked down in 2 previous ones, and they had just rebuilt their wall after another similar accident. So it's getting ridiculous, it really is. We always walk along the other side because, quite honestly, it's less dangerous. Someone's going to be killed on the pavement soon. I think some have been before, but it'll take another one until they actually do something.
You've got to stop them coming down at that speed. I mean, they're not going to do that. They've got to be banned.
I think a lorry ban's the answer.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
both live and work in North Kensington. I actually work under the elevated motorway called Westways. It effectively split North Kensington in two. People became very isolated. The motorway, when it was built, in fact, a lot of the shops in the area were taken down. All the small housing came down in order to make room for the motorway. So you had communities completely split up and separated, and apart from the motorway, of course, at the same time, tower blocks went up as well. So you had, I mean, the typical concrete jungle. And of course, one of the greatest ironies is that it splits North Ken in half, and you can't actually get onto the road from North Kensington. You have actually got to go down to Shepherd's Bush. Which people also say is actually the very final insult.
Take 3, take 5.
The railway companies have caused nothing but trouble to my family. They've pulled down so many houses in Somerstown, that's where we live now, that it's ever so hard to find a room. And I don't never remember the rents as high as they are now. A gentleman came along our street a little while ago, asking all sorts of questions, and he seemed ever so shocked when I said to him that me, Bill, and the children all lived in one room. He said it was unhealthy and immoral. Well, we can't afford more than one room now. When I was a little girl, we lived in Agar Town. That's near where they built St Pancras Station. But the landlord turned us out because he had to sell the house to the railway company and they pulled it down. It was round about that time a gentleman wrote a lot about what happened to people like us. But I don't think no one took no notice. Oh, and it's ever so
Now, if, as many persons hastily assume, the poor, when dislodged from their squalid dwellings, were driven to a purer air and to larger and cleaner houses, their ejection might be looked upon as a blessing, and we should regard the improvements which swept away the homes of the poor as an unmixed benefit. But the poor are shoveled out of one side of a parish only to render more overcrowded the stifling apartments in another. Improvements tend to concentrate the demand for labor, and this will necessarily concentrate the families which subsist by labor. The special lure to capitalists offered by railway projectors is that the line will pass only through inferior property and will destroy only the abodes of the powerless and the poor, whilst it will avoid the properties of those whose opposition is to be dreaded, the great employers of labor.
Well, look at the area now. You can hardly recognize the place. They've built stations and warehouses and lines all over the place. Ever so many people have had to move out to make way for them. And them lot are still writing and talking about how poor people like us live. There's even a Royal Commission about it now.
Do you think the recent demolition in the southern portion of the parish of St Pancras has been the main cause of the overcrowding?
I think it has, particularly the demolition of houses by the Midland Railway Company. About 500 houses in Somerstown have been removed.
Was any alternative accommodation provided for the displaced population?
No alternative accommodation was provided for them.
The Act of Parliament provided that such provision should be made, did it not?
It did, but it was never carried out.
And could the people remove without any inconvenience to themselves?
I think that many workers must live in a neighborhood in which they do live because their employment depends upon it. Others, again, live there from sheer habit.
Well, of course we want to stay here. It's our home. We've always lived in this area. Well, Bill can usually get labouring work and, well, I can take in a bit of sewing. And even the children could get a few coppers carrying for the ladies and gentlemen that travel on the railways. Well, people do say it's healthier in the suburbs. But how could we get any work? People like us can't afford train fares.
Mr. Dover, many people are concerned about the environmental consequences of urban road building. How do you view that from your experience?
Well, they're very right to be worried about it, but I do believe that you also get environmental problems if you have too much traffic coming into an area where the road system is not adequate to take it. Therefore, I would like, frankly, to see more urban roads and motorways in and around London to make sure the traffic does flow.
Increasing the capacity of major radial roads into inner London, such as the Hackney M11 link or Archway road, can only feed the problem of congestion at the centre. And that's a problem that isn't soluble by more road building. This was, I think, amply demonstrated in the mid-60s by the Buchanan report. They explored one rectangle in central London, bounded by Marylebone Road, Oxford Street, Tottenham Court Road, and Great Portland Street. And they asked what would have to be done to permit that rectangle to cope with the unrestrained increases in car ownership which were being forecast for the rest of the country. And they concluded that the area of parking alone which would have been required would be almost as great as the area itself. So that the area would have had to be completely rebuilt on 3 levels. An underground level for parking, a ground level for traffic, and a pedestrian level for people to provide access to shops and houses. And even then they concluded that most of the people coming into this rectangle would still have to come by public transport because the surrounding network wouldn't be able to cope with all the cars that would be trying to come in and get out. So I think the conclusion is obvious. It's simply a nonsense to try and plan to permit free access to the centre of London by car.
Compliments of man in a corner. You approve?
Interesting.
That's Tico, the mixer sherry.
So whose idea is that?
Harvey's.
Tell Harvey. He's got great taste.
Tico. You may not like the idea, but you'll love the taste.
Well, the bird's eye sweet trolley is tempting in the extreme. Desserts too delicious to resist an end-of-meal dream. Well, there's dairy cream sponge and eclairs.
A smooth provocation of cheesecake.
Countless gorgeous gateaux.
It's enough to make your knees quake.
There's super whip to lavish around. There's super mousse and trifle. There's Arctic circles and Arctic rolls.
To together they're a real life-all.
Roll on the bird's eye, sweet trolley, it's the perfect end to meal. So when you can't help yourself, just help yourself to the best desserts on wheels.
Roll on the bird's eye sweet trolley for the best desserts on wheels.
Ask 30 washing machine manufacturers which machine they'd recommend, and you'll get 30 answers. But ask about a powder, and there's only one they all approve. New System Persil Automatic. Its unique new system, which includes a biological action, performs superbly across the wash. But at lower temperatures, it gives you results no other powder can beat. Plus Persil Care for your clothes and your machine. That's why for all these manufacturers, New System Persil Automatic is an automatic choice.
Take a hint of fruit with clear, sparkling spring water. New Piedmont. Clean. Light. Refreshing. Piedmont with the hint of fruit. Go on, take the hint.
As Toyota dealers, we'd like to invite you to a test drive. Chances are it won't be quite this exciting, but we think you'll be pleasantly surprised. Whichever of our 22 models you choose. Get down to our showroom soon. We've got some great cars to show you. Naturally, we'd rather you kept to the roads. Toyota, that's motoring.
Kon-Tiki. Clean, sharp, refreshing light spirit. With the keen taste of tropical citrus fruit. Discover a tropical oasis in Kon-Tiki.
Well, the road lobby is, as a term, encompasses the various lobbies that operate on behalf of people who run motor vehicles, who make motor vehicles, who sell the petrol that they fill them up with, and sell the tyres that they run on, and who build the roads, from the civil engineers to the consulting engineers, people who design roads. This industrial group is the road lobby and is commonly termed the road lobby. As an organisation, there's separate parts of the road lobby. There's bits like, for example, the Road Haulage Association, the Freight Transport Association, the Automobile Association, the RAC. They have slightly different objectives and they sometimes fall out a bit, but I think it's remarkable how little they've fallen out over the years. I can think of literally one disagreement over the last 10 years, which was between the Road Haulage Association and the AA, and it was over lorries. The AA didn't like lorries for a time, but it was smoothed over remarkably quickly, and I think part of the credit, if you can call it credit, part of the credit for that goes to people like the British Road Federation, which is a coordinating body for the various interests in the road lobby. And is effectively its mouthpiece.
You say there's no road lobby, but do you not agree that your interests often coincide with the interests of road construction firms?
I do indeed. I would say less of road construction firms than with other motoring organisations.
How much do you think you personally managed to influence government road building policy in your role as a parliamentary consultant for Wimpey's?
Well, the feeling of the construction industry is that, frankly, there's still a long way to go on the motorway programme, that there should be more investment in roads, motorways, because that reduces the cost to industry and increases the output nationwide and therefore helps the creation of wealth. And I try to make sure that Wimpey's view and the construction industry view is put to government, basically get on with more capital investment and cut direct ongoing public expenditure. And we feel that that would be in the nation's interests.
When I was designing local authority housing, we were then talking about increasing the cost of housing by something like £2,000 per dwelling in order to mitigate against just the noise that lorries make, let alone the way that they disturb the environment. And if you add up all the housing on main roads which are affected by lorries, you find that something like £500 million would be spent if we were to treat all housing on main roads in the way that the Department of the Environment thought that new local authority housing should be treated.
Lorries don't damage roads, they wear them out, and we're very glad that they wear them out, because roads being worn out by lorries is a sure sign that the economy is healthy and freight is being moved about. Roads are there to be worn out by freight transport being moved on them.
The cost of mitigating the nuisance of sound is not even borne by the Department of Transport. It's borne out of general taxes through the Department of the Environment. If in fact it was paid through the Department of Transport and through lorry operators, the lorry operators wouldn't consider bringing lorries through London because it would just cost them too much.
Obviously, the association, as a service, or serving a service industry, simply reacts to a demand. We feel that if movement of goods by road is the cheapest and most effective way of moving goods, then obviously the road transport industry is going to grow, as indeed it has grown over the last 25 years. But we certainly don't in any way put the boot in for the railways.
I mean, the road lobby does not like public transport at all, and its main objection is that there's money poured into British Rail and into bus subsidies which could, in their view, be spent on building roads. And that's why they frequently bring out arguments about Britain ought to be investing in the transport system instead of wasting money on revenue expenditure. And if in effect that's a code for saying we shouldn't be spending money on cheap bus fares, but we should be spending money on building roads.
How do you get your association's views across to government? You have quite a lot of contact with government yourself, I believe.
Oh yes, we do indeed. The chairman, the national chairman of the association, who is a member, an elected member of the organisation, operates frequently and regularly at ministerial level. We see a lot of the transport ministers. My executives, permanent staff in the head office here and throughout the country operate, again, at their own level, generally speaking, with the civil servants who have to put the minister's policy into effect. We are often asked by government to give our views on various things, but I would make the point that we have no hesitation in speaking out fearlessly if we believe that proposed legislation is wrong or shouldn't be introduced. We make our views known pretty forcibly.
And do you have informal contacts with officials and ministers, as well as attending policy committee meetings?
Oh yes, yes, we frequently meet MPs and politicians on an informal basis.
How would you react to people who would say this gives the road lobby, as it's sometimes called, an unfair advantage over ordinary people who want some sort of say in transport policy?
There's a lot of nonsense talked about the road lobby in this country. There is no such thing. There are a number of organizations who do their best for the road users they represent. We are one of them. Obviously, sometimes the interests coincide, and there is what appears to be collective action, but this is rarely the case. Occasionally we get together with the others. Mostly we act on our own, in our own interest, but it appears to outsiders that there is something called a road lobby in action. It has been described to me as rich and powerful. In fact, nothing could be further from the truth. We're not rich and powerful. We're a company limited by guarantee. We exist on the subscriptions from our members, and they jolly soon see that we're not rich and powerful. So there is no road lobby as such.
We obviously talk to the Department of Transport and civil servants in the department on a regular basis. They consult us when they're considering new legislation or new policies which would affect freight transport.
The road lobby operates through fairly conventional lobbying practice. I mean, it lobbies MPs, members of both houses of Parliament, of course, and it also lobbies civil servants. And of course, it is quite good at this. And it's quite good because they talk the same language, they come from the same class, they come from the same background, they go out to nice little restaurants, and at the expense account lunch, they'll pose their problems to the civil servants and see if the civil servants will do something to help them. One of the weaknesses of the road lobby is that it is a vested interest, which is also one of its strengths, of course. It has a lot of money. But it means that there isn't any popular support amongst ordinary people. The people who turn up at motorway inquiries are just paid hacks.
But at the same time, you do agree you have all sorts of informal contacts. You invite ministers to functions. You see them in all sorts of different situations which the ordinary member of the public wouldn't have the opportunity of coming across members.
Oh, no, I'm afraid I can't agree with this line at all. That is the purpose of an association, to serve the interests of its members.
Well, this is a leak from the Department of Transport. But I mean, it's important, I think, because it illustrates just how close the road lobby and the civil servants in the Department of Transport are. Now, it's an internal memorandum which was written in 1978 by a senior civil servant in the Department of Transport, Joe Peeler, to his boss, Peter Lazarus, who was then the Deputy Chief Civil Servant in the Department of Transport and has since become the Chief Civil Servant in the Department of Transport. And it's about an inquiry, or it's about setting up an inquiry into raising the weight of heavy lorries. And it suggests, and actually uses the word, rigging the inquiry. One of the reasons that the civil servant puts forward, and I quote from the document, although the establishment in the public mind of a clear and overwhelming case on balance for heavier lorry weights is seen as the main end of the inquiry, it could well have wider effects. It should provide a focus for the various road haulage interests to get together, marshal their forces, and act cohesively to produce a rarely good case which should not merely establish the main point at issue, but should do good to their now sadly tarnished public image. This would make it easier for the government to propose legislation on lorry weights and other matters in their favour. And I think there's two main points. A, just how close the department and the road lobby are on this evidence. And secondly, I mean, quite how cynical the Department of Transport is to set up an inquiry and to rig it.
Meeting her husband from India, please contact the urban information desk. Mrs. Anita Fernandez, please contact the urban information desk. Mohammed, India, meeting Mohammed Ayub, please go to the immigration desk at the meeting point. Mohammed, India, please go to the immigration desk at the meeting point. Meeting Jared Iqbal, please go to the immigration desk.
Good afternoon, sir. Can I help you?
Good afternoon. My name is Schulenberg. You have a car reserved for me.
Yes, you're number one member.
Good. Nice meeting you. Good luck with the IT deal. Thank you very much. Okay. Auf Wiedersehen.
Unemployment's dropped a bit, but the underlying trend is still up. The latest total is 3,186,386.
So... The northbound carriageway is totally blocked and you'll be diverted off the motorway at junction 5. If you're heading in the other direction, you'll find a 40-mile-an-hour speed limit. Jane Markham of the AA.
Gatwick operations are also going well for Air Tours, British Airways and British Caledonian, with the exception of a 50-minute delay to KT 481 from Las Palmas.
And now the LBC currency check. The American dollar, 1.44 3/4.
Hi, Louis.
What's that?
You been a good boy?
Yeah, where?
Okay, Evan.
Where you been?
I've been in New York. I've got a present. Close your eyes. Open up your hand. You like it?
Wow, thanks, Dad. I think that's for my teeth.
Maestro Brandon Clark, linking luxury and refinement with technology.
Please fasten your seatbelt.
And now, a fusion of space,
Dad, let him go out.
No.
Oh, she don't like going in the cloud.
The area that I represent in North Islington is very typical of inner city areas and inner city constituencies. The people that have access to cars is probably as low as 10%. Therefore, we need public transport. We don't need major roads being built. And if the road building programme goes on, and transport planning is always designed to move heavy goods by road and encourage private transport rather than public transport, then at the end of the day, it is a major social disruptive effect it has in inner city areas like Birmingham, Manchester, Liverpool, every city you can think of, where close-knit, pleasant communities have been literally torn apart by roads being smashed through them, literally been torn apart because public transport has got worse. And the effects of public transport cuts are very, very serious indeed.
Dad, I've got it again. I'm not going, I've got it. I've got my ladybird.
Every other European city has recognised that it's got to develop public transport systems, not private transport systems. But here we are going through this appalling exercise now of motorway building and of taking away democratic control in London over the London Transport Board, so that we will have once more direct ministerial control over all public transport systems in London. And with this bunch up here, the people that control this building here, this Department of Transport, I fear for public transport in London. And what it will mean is people walking, people being forced to buy cars, overcrowded roads, and above all, isolated elderly people stuck at home because there is no bus that they can afford to go on to get around the place. So in their city, they become prisoners.
fact is that London grew up with a rail network. It was a highly radial network, and it was highly efficient at channeling huge numbers of people into central London. And with this network, central London was the peak of access for the whole of the metropolitan area. Now, with car travel, road transport, what was the peak of access has become a sink of congestion. And it's simply not possible to solve that congestion problem by building the road capacity. And until that is recognized, any further road building can only exacerbate the existing problems. I think the response to those problems has been fairly obvious. People and jobs are moving out. Between the 1971 census and the 1981 census, the 4 innermost boroughs of London lost about 25% of their population. And jobs also have been moving out. So the number of people coming into central London in the morning rush hour now is less than it's ever been, although the number coming in by car is greater than it's ever been. Now, people sometimes say that you can't penalize the car because public transport couldn't cope if you tried to encourage more people to use public transport. Well, if everyone coming down the Archway Road today in their cars were put back onto the Northern Line would still be carrying fewer passengers than it carried in the early 60s. So historically, London has demonstrated that its public transport system can cope.
And clear of the door, please.
The GLC was elected on a clear mandate to try to solve London's traffic problems by reducing fares on public transport, improving the quality of the service, therefore making it more attractive and getting people out of cars onto public transport. We were challenged through the courts, and it's interesting because in the first court, the High Court, we won, and it was on appeal to Lord Denning that Bromley started winning on the case, and it was decided that we'd acted illegally. I think the judgment was clearly a political judgment by the law courts because they didn't like our policies, and it lasted for 6 months, the cheaper fares and better transport, and as a result we've now seen it's fully assessed, and we know, for example, that car commuting to central London in the morning peak period reduced by over 6%, and that when the fares were doubled as a result of the Law Lords ruling, we saw an increase in car commuting by 14%, and there was an extra 5,000 accidents on the roads of London, injuries in those accidents, and that was a cost of over £20 million to Londoners, as well as, of course, the human suffering involved. Well, as regards the proposals for abolishing the GLC's control over the LT and then ultimately abolishing the GLC altogether, it's a complete nonsense in terms of transport planning. The worst aspects of what the government is proposing is that for the first time in over 100 years, Londoners won't have a citywide elected voice. And what they're proposing by creating these quangos is that non-elected people should meet in secret behind closed doors and make decisions that are going to affect the lives of all of us.
Tell us what you're doing here today. We're here to lobby our MPs mainly about pensioners, about our bus passes, because we know full well that they have not promised to give us our bus passes. They have not promised to give us our bus passes. They have only promised to give concessionary passes, which means we know for a fact that they're going to take our bus passes away, and we're up in arms about it. We demand us, the people of our age who fought in the last war, who've been forced to retire at 60 and 65, our wage has been taken away from us, and we demand that we keep our bus pass.
It's absolutely disgraceful that a rich country like ours should have our pensioners more or less on the breadline.
And you tell them that even in Ireland, the poorest of poor countries, they get free bus permit, free train travel and free ferry travel in ERA. And yet in our so-called rich country, they can't afford to give us free bus permit in all the country. And they're wanting to take away our free bus permit in Greater London.
Well, basically, the bill would mean the end of London transport as we know it. It would mean unemployment for our members. It would be bad for the social life of London, because the old age pensioners would lose their passes in certain areas. In other areas, the council would support them and keep their passes. Total chaos. The privateers would move in, cream off the the routes that pay and the services that pay, and the rest just go to the wall, because who's going to pay for it? Because we lose half our subsidy as soon as the bill becomes law.
British Rail Management have just agreed their new corporate plan with the government, which cuts the subsidy to the railways back to the 1975 level. British Rail offered to do this in 5 years. The government's response, and it's typically anti-public transport response, was that this should be done in 3 years. It really means that we've got a very low subsidy on the railway in comparison with any other railways in the world. And it compares very unfavourably with, for example, the £2,000 million subsidy per year that the government gives to people with company cars.
It's diabolical and disgusting the way that we've been treated over the years and over the past months. We've done everything. We've done no demarcations. We've done away with all the stricter practices. We've carried out retraining, redeployment, and also reorganisation. That half of the works over there, the east side of the works is being done away with. We're all coming over to this side of the works, and we was hoping to maintain a staff of about 2,300. To come down to this sort of level, which Mr. Dunkley, the P&A manager of BREL, has said that Swindon could be vulnerable.
This is Bristol Temple Meads. This is Bristol Temple Meads now, line 7, C56 train from Bolton Harbour.
This was the old, what we call the old station. Went to most of the aspects signalling. They did away with this part of the station, and that would be about 1962. And 1963 it became a car park. As the ownership of motor cars came in, and the bigger juggernauts, and that's all attributed to it. Our little island's not big enough for the amount of traffic that's on the roads. Especially these juggernauts, it's absolutely ridiculous. You only got to look at these little villages where houses get knocked down. People are afraid to walk on pavements. I mean, they got all the tracks laid down. Yeah. Intercity tracks. There's no need for these juggernauts at all. No need for them.
Do you think this is the government striking out at public transport?
I believe it is. I mean, their policy is for private to hive off viable works. We have viable works in BRER that could be hived off into the private sector.
Yeah. Of course, the old trouble is finance. We're struggling to keep the railways going, and we've cut down and cut down and cut down. Branch lines been closed because the government is more concerned with road traffic than it is with rail-borne traffic. You take any country in the world, their railways are financed by their governments. But all they seem to do in this country is take money away from the railways. As we make a little profit, so they cut down our expenditure. Whereas they're cut down left, right and centre. And where's the money going? Into somebody's pockets. Certainly not the railways.
I'm not surprised that British Rail are not allowing you to film on their property. It's quite amazing that the British Rail Management, who are supposed to be protecting and managing the railways, are in fact helping the Tory government to dismantle the British Rail network. And I think this film will prove very embarrassing for them.
Millions of people have tried the Special K pinch. Try it for yourself. And if you can pinch more than an inch, try the Kellogg's Special K breakfast. It's the enjoyable way to cut down on calories. Details on every weight-watching packet.
Why is your 5 called Ben-Hur?
Because it has a host of extras.
The all-new Renault 5. What's yours called?
Tony Curtis, Cassandra Domenica, Eric Estrada, Peter Lawford, Ron Moody, Donald Pleasance, and Orson Welles are asking the burning question, where is Parsifal?
He's a very nice man. He tells me jokes. He's got puppets everywhere.
Grown-ups may find it hard to believe, but kids are now talking like this about their dentists.
I like my dentist.
Over the years, Colgate's been campaigning for one thing.
What's a cavity?
Kids without cavities.
I've never had toothache.
And great-tasting Colgate can help.
Toothache? I wouldn't like that.
Colgate's own unique double fluoride formulation gives the best protection a toothpaste can. Working together, we could see a lot more kids with no more cavities. So now's the time to join our dental care campaign, aiming for Colgate instead of cavities.
Brownston pickle tonight, then?
Of course.
You're sure it's Brownston from Cross and Blackwell? Nothing else will do, you know. All those succulent, crisp vegetables and that distinctive tangy sauce. Unique. That's the only word for it. Absolutely unique.
A little something to go with it.
Delicious.
Seconds?
Bring out the Branston. Nothing else will do. You and Cross and Blackwell make tastier meals.
If you separate, get leaflet FB3 from a Social Security office or PO Box 21, Stanmore, Middlesex.
Cities are part of our culture. We've always lived in cities, and if we start dividing our cities up with roads, fragmenting our towns, dispersing our populations, we're going to finish up with an endless suburbia, no contrast, no countryside, very little farming land. And there are great advantages in living in cities. If we live to a reasonably high density, our shops and our pubs and our primary schools can be within walking distance of our front doors. If we spread ourselves out all over the place, we have to have a car in order to go anywhere. And this is not urban living.
Good afternoon, Milton Keynes Development Corporation. Good afternoon, Milton Keynes Development Corporation.
The plan for Milton Keynes is on the grid pattern. It's about at 1 kilometre, or about 5/8 of a mile grid in rough terms. You have to remember
that Milton Keynes was designated by government to provide accommodation for people who, of course, didn't live here at the time. So as a development corporation, we always have to bear in mind that we're planning not just for the present, and not just for the present population, but also for the future. And that is, to some extent, a dilemma. So whilst we try and make sure that people are well informed about future plans for areas that perhaps at the moment are green fields, we also have to take into account our view of what the city needs and what those people who are going to move here in the future need. So there's consultation and information, but it's not quite as straightforward as just dealing with a population who are here already and whose views are the only consideration.
It's a strange situation for a borough council, it really is. Because they can object to things that the corporation plans to do, but they can't stop them doing it.
Really?
Oh no, Development Corporation is its own planning authority. The only person who can stop us doing anything is the Department of Environment, the Secretary of State. And if he doesn't object, then that's it, goes ahead.
The plan faced a real dilemma in terms of transport because it rightly, in my opinion, put a lot of emphasis on this congestion-free traffic system, which of course by its nature means that people, if they have a car, can use it easily, and it means there is very little disincentive in Milton Keynes to use a car. Now, if you look at most cities, you find that some people use public transport because it's difficult to use a car. There's nothing inherently difficult about the plan for Milton Keynes for the public transport system, except that because people can use their car easily, there's no great incentive for them to leave it at home and use the bus. So, of course, people who use the bus are usually those who don't have access to a car. Over the years, and particularly in the late 70s, I suppose there has been a shift in the emphasis, and certainly now the role of an economic growth point is as important as the role of providing housing opportunities. In terms of industrial investment, we're attracting a lot of companies, including a lot from overseas, and I think we have a dual role these days to do both those things. As far as state support is concerned, the state support is expected to and is actually diminishing each year as we're more able to rely on private sector investment. If we get permission to go ahead with the heliport, and you probably know that we're in the middle of an inquiry right now on that, then I think the main users are going to be the business community, and certainly the support that we've had from the heliport has come very strongly from the business community, who believe that helicopters, as indeed we do from the studies we've done, believe helicopters are going to be an increasingly important part of transportation over the next 10, 20, 50 years for certain lengths of trip. And we're talking particularly about 60 to 100 miles. But I can foresee a situation, certainly in a not too distant future, where it may get much broader than just the business community, where, for instance, you might, if you lived in Milton Keynes, be getting on a helicopter to get to Heathrow, to get on your plane to go on holiday in the summer. And it might be just about as cheap and certainly much more convenient than trying to drive to the airport.
This is possibly the most infamous example of a planner's dream and a resident's nightmare. A half a mile of motorway from nowhere to nowhere. And I'm standing on the stub end of this motorway, the M41. And to the left are houses stretching to Harrow on the Hill, and to the right down to the depth of South London. This is a classic example of once a drawing is planned by the Department of Transport, the threat of blight remains on housing for as far as you can see and beyond.
If you're a pedestrian around here, you don't count as far as the planners are concerned. Everything is directed towards saving drivers' time because that's valued very highly. Pedestrians aren't seen as having any value, and women, obviously, are the majority of the pedestrians. Around here at the moment, they're shopping. Women also use public transport a great deal to get to work, but the planners hardly count their time as worth anything at all. So you get the stupid situation that a man commuting to work by car is seen as important in planning terms, and a woman going to get the tube just here, or the bus, is seen as having no importance.
COBA is the Department of Transport's method for evaluating road schemes. COBA, short for cost-benefit analysis. And what it attempts to do is compare the costs of a road scheme with its benefits.
COBA isn't an easy thing for people to understand. I mean, this is the user manual for it, which describes how an engineer can run it. The output from a COBA can be enormous. On the Archway road scheme, it comes out about that high, and it's in 9 large computer files. So it's not something done lightly, but it's something of enormous importance to the ministry, because that's the way they fool the Treasury, that their road schemes are value for money.
It's a peculiar assessment insofar as it has one major cost element, the cost of building the road. That involves also the cost of acquiring the land and so on. And the benefits. Now, the benefits consist of time, vehicle operating costs, and accident savings. Within its own terms, I think the method is, well, hilarious. It involves attaching a cash value to a human life. Now, in June 1979 prices, according to the most recent COBA manual, a human life was worth £101,900. In 1976, it was worth £42,000. So the value of life is indexed for inflation.
One of the other major problems with using COBA in London is that its policy to restrain traffic coming into London in the peak hour, and that's why we've got central area parking restraint and that sort of thing. If you speed up that traffic as a result of building a road, COBA will count that as a benefit. So that benefit that is shown in COBA is actually directly contrary to the public policy.
If a new road and all the additional traffic that goes with it is going to cause more noise, is going to be ugly, is going to divide communities, there is simply no way that the analysis can take those factors into consideration.
What most people don't realize is what a motorway means for a lot of people. It can mean having your house smashed down, and frequently worse than that, it can mean having your house put onto a motorway and made an extremely nasty place to live in. Well, this is saying that really the main thing in people's lives has been reduced to nothing, and for a lot of elderly people it can mean actual death. I mean, it is recognized that elderly people often die when motorways are built near them, either because they've actually lost their home or simply because they can't stand the dreadful noise day after day after day.
My experience of the inquiry was a great eye-opener, because I went in believing, as most people do, that if one presented a reasoned argument against the Department of Transport schemes, that might carry some weight. But my conclusion, having attended the inquiry for nearly a year, is that the system as it exists today is just a very grand and expensive game which is put on by the Department of Transport in an attempt, they hope, to demonstrate that democracy is at work.
Now, at the 1973 inquiry, for example, the first Archway inquiry, many of us, including myself, spent a long time preparing a case. I took a lot of time off work. I gave my own case. It lasted about 2.5 days. Well, the inspector just chucked it in the dustbin. He totally misrepresented my case in his report. The ministry barrister made a few sneering remarks about it, and that was that. Now, even had the inspector agreed with my case or anybody else's case, and had said said, well, yes, I agree, the motorway shouldn't be built. The ministry hasn't got the slightest obligation to listen to the inspector, and in fact, it has frequently been the case. It has been the case that in the few instances where an inspector has recommended against a motorway, the ministry has said, well, we're going to build it again.
I can only say that if the department has set its mind on, for instance, turning the North Circular Road into a 6-lane motorway, then all they need to do is say that that is government policy, and objectors may not challenge government policy at a public inquiry, and no amount of reasoned argument on the part of objectors will deflect the department from their course.
We have in fact got a Ministry of Road Transport stuffed with engineers with antiquated ideas, extraordinarily bad taste, who are concerned to further the interests of the road lobby. They're not concerned with promoting railways or canals. In fact, they want to concrete the railways over. And in fact, I'd like to quote, this isn't just the idea of mad Archway objectors. A leader in May 1982 in the Sunday Times contained the following sentence, that the officials of the Ministry of Transport were in bed with the road lobby and the ministers concerned could only stand by and cough. There's no way that they are going to give a fair inquiry.
Well, one of the first requirements of a fair inquiry is that it should be final. Now, we've been through an inquiry in 73. They couldn't build the motorway then. They couldn't build it at the inquiry in 76. They couldn't build it in 77. And so now they just call a fourth inquiry. Every time you win an inquiry, they say, all right, that didn't happen, and we'll do it again, which could never possibly happen in any kind of legal situation. Now, the other totally basic things to even have the beginnings of a fair inquiry, I mean just the beginnings, I'm not saying this would make it fair, but it would go a tiny way towards it, is that firstly the inquiry be public, and being public means that it's held entirely in the evening, because the vast majority of people can only be there in the evening, and this is absolutely fundamental. It's vital that objectors should have full transcripts and other documents made freely available to them, whereas what the ministry try and do is either supply nothing at all or supply it at outrageous cost, and that again is happening at the Archway inquiry. Well, in the 77 inquiry, in fact, the inspector then, Ralph, did give us some of those things, by no means all, but he gave us some. He gave us the whole inquiry in the evenings, and he gave us a pretty fair number of transcripts available freely. That inquiry had the beginnings of a fair inquiry. Well, what happened? The ministry didn't like a fair inquiry, so they just took Rolf away. It was just like that British Telecom advertisement. A hand reached in and said, right, this inspector is giving you a fair inquiry, and the minister more or less said that in Parliament. It didn't look as if the inquiry would finish soon, and he just plucked Ralph away, took him away, announced that the inquiry was annulled, that it had never happened, and then additionally spread a series of libels and slurs about us, suggesting we'd disrupted it, which is completely contradicted by the evidence of the transcripts.
The latest idea is that the public inquiry system should be abolished altogether. Because it's so expensive and it's causing so much trouble with all these objectors refusing to be concreted over without causing a lot of fuss. And so the powers that be have said that why not just do away with the inquiry system, and government departments will decide where a road is going to be built, and objectors will just be supplied with a complaints book after the road is built, where they can say what it is that they don't like about it.
The 1984 inquiry was really a repeat of the previous inquiries, because it had three important features which they had, but in greater amounts, namely lies, smears and intimidation by the government of us. The most blatant lie, and I could mention many others, was about the question of evening sessions. The whole 1977 inquiry had been held in the evening, and that meant that local people could attend their inquiry into their district, and that's why we won the inquiry and why the ministry lost. And they pulled out all stops, as indeed did the inspector, to stop us having the inquiry in the evening in 1984. And the ministry barrister, Burford, told a shameless lie to the inspector and to us, saying that the Archway Methodist Hall was not available after 9:30. Well, one of our number phoned up and found out that, of course, you could have the hall at any time you want for any function whatsoever, provided you paid cash. And Burford was described by myself and other people as a liar, dirty liar, as far as I remember, or stinking liar, I think, to be precise, and he hasn't sued yet. But the amazing thing was that Air Marshal Giddings, the super inspector, the super fair man, simply refused to do anything about it. I mean, he'd been lied to in the most blatant way possible, and he refused to take any action or to do anything about it, except against us, of course. Well, I mentioned smears. Now, as a result of our winning the 1977 inquiry, whatever slight incidents of heckling and so on there had been from time to time, which were far less than you get at any council meeting or any sitting of the House of Commons, these minor events were expanded by people like Hugh Rossi, like a sort of inverted pyramid, a tiny fact at the bottom and a huge pyramid of lies above it, until finally Rossi circulated a letter saying we'd kill the inspector, a man who's still alive and working, incidentally, you know, so far from having been killed. Well, the same happened this time, but even worse. We were told that Air Marshal Giddings, a former deputy chief of the defense staff, had resigned because he'd received six abusive letters and what seemed to be a small number of abusive telephone calls. Now, this to me is totally incredible. Anybody can turn abusive telephone calls off just like that by just ringing up British Telecom and asking to have your calls intercepted, and you don't have to be an air marshal for that. And it's just a fact that anybody in public life whose name is in the telephone directory gets abusive calls. And it is also true that these things seem to happen mainly after the air marshal had ruled in our favor, which makes it quite obvious that we had nothing to do with it. Well, I don't believe that he resigned on those grounds, but of course this again was made the occasion of a massive media cum government orchestrated campaign of hysteria, culminating in the statement by the Lord Chancellor, Lord Hailsham, that the next inspector would be instructed in how to call the police and how to have his phone intercepted. Well, I mean, that statement of Hailsham's, suggesting that an air marshal doesn't know how to call the police, illustrates how the whole of this thing is just a baseless smear. And as regards intimidation, well, at the 77 inquiry, there had been masses of police, and we were very chary of this, though in the normal way we're the sort of people who like policemen, because one policeman had gone hysterical and started throttling a man in front of his terrified family, and there was at least one other case of police assault, and we just did not want to have policemen there in that way.
The inquiry began with an attempt by the Department of Transport and Departments of Environment to really quickly push through our objections to the procedures of the inquiry, to quickly start the thing, to deny us evening meetings, to deny us a creche, to deny us documents, to deny us transcripts, to deny our points about procedure.
objected to this scheme?
No, I haven't. No. There's not been a lot of publicity about it. I mean, only except in the advertising columns of local papers, that's the only place I've seen it. I mean,
do you think maybe it's just for the officials to have a public inquiry, not necessarily
well, I
for
think
the
most of these decisions are already made, and this is only like a screen put up to say, well, we've inquired into it, and people say this and people say that. The decision's already made.
So that is the whole panorama, you see. Where those tower blocks are and those sheds, that side of them, is the runway, where those ships are. In between all this is going to be an airport. So a lot of this here, what is here, has got to go. There's no doubt about it. It's got to go. Now, if we're taking things to the extreme and there was an accident and it hit this tower block, but it not only hits this tower block, there's little houses underneath you, and underneath everybody, isn't there? And you know,
it's not on that. You've got the school and
I mean, all the there is thousands of tons of chemicals in here in this lot. You've got to understand that the campaign are made of ordinary people that are at work. And how that, you know, they haven't got a copy of this because it's down our People's Plant Centre, and they've got to come in after work, where volunteers have got to go and open up so that they can come in. These people, they've got offices, they can sit in and go through their evidence day after day to see, to dot the I's and cross the T's and make sure it's all right. But we haven't got that advantage at all. And so we've got to go through the whole of these as we get them day after day in and day out. We just can't do it.
You're a number of small local groups have joined together, you're taking on the London Docklands Development Corporation, the CPI, the Port of London Authority, the British Airport Authority, the Department of Trade, the Department of Transport, the Civil Aviation Authority. Things are pretty much weighted in their favour.
Yeah, well, I think then we all deserve an Oscar, don't we?
not allowed in with cameras.
Okay. Excuse me, sir, but the inspector said he doesn't want cameras in.
Why not?
I don't know, you'll have to ask the inspector, but that's his ruling. So I'm afraid these
It's the ruling of the Central Office of Information. It clearly
that's
is.
the inspector's
It's clearly
instructions.
the ruling of the Central Office of Information. If you read these notices, they've
Well, I'm afraid
changed
you'll
their
really have
story
to
time and
argue
time
that.
again.
Yeah, well, I'm afraid you'll have to argue that
The
out.
inspector told me that these notes that have been sent out...
But you know the rule, you've been asked to leave, you'll have to
Well,
really
not his
argue
notes at all. They've been completely faked by the Central Office of
I don't know
Information.
anything about that, but you really will have to argue that out with the inspector, not with us.
Would you leave the hall now, please? Do you intend to leave the hall?
I might be too late.
Take it out, please. Hey, no violence, old men. That's unfair. You shouldn't hit somebody younger than you. Don't use physical force.
He's pushing me.
No, you are shoving him. Don't do it. No, you're not. You're bullying him. Come along. You are a little man who's getting too jolly big for your boots.
It's lunchtime. They can do what they like.
3380 and 3277.
They didn't have a chance this morning. That's the whole point.
Mr. Burford, you were accused of lying at one of the pre-inquiry sessions about the availability of the hall. Perhaps you care to make a statement about that. Do you hear us, Mr. Burford? Mr. Burford, you've been accused of lying on behalf of the Department of Transport.
Here we are at the 4th Archway inquiry, and we've got an inspector who spent all this time going through the local papers telling us what a wonderful man he is and how he's a friend of the objectors, and he's come here, he's given a number of undertakings that he would make decisions. We're here on the first day of the full inquiry, and he hasn't made a single decision. He's wormed his way out of every single undertaking that he said he would make. Unfortunately, some people have trusted this inspector. It's been proven that he's not a man whose word can be trusted.
Well, I would like to ask Hugh about his accusation of us killing two inspectors.
I didn't say you killed them.
You did. You said, I can quote you verbatim, I have got a letter which you wrote to 4 people saying that we drove an inspector to a nervous breakdown and hence to an early grave. Now that's absolutely on the paper.
Robin.
I've got it in writing. I can show it to you. You wrote it to 4 people. You then said that your secretary had made a mistake, and you said you almost killed him.
The correct statement was that one particular inspector was almost driven to an early grave, and one inspector, in fact, health was very, very seriously affected by the appalling behaviour of a lot of people.
I spoke to both of them. You said we drove an inspector to an early grave, and you changed it afterwards.
He was chased out of the building. He was chased into a lavatory. The poor man had a breakdown.
I called on him. We had tea together a month ago. We were very happy together, and he was very pleased to see me. That's the man that we're accused of killing.
On a general point, a lot of the people in the area where we come from are very interested in the whole fairness of public inquiries like this to the local community. And I wondered if you had a general point on how you feel about the fairness of giving a fair hearing to people in the local community.
Well, as far as one can be objective, I think they are pretty fair. I think they vary with the objectors mainly. It depends to a very large extent on the way objectors present their case and the responsible way in which they present their case. But in my experience, I think they're very fair.
Would it surprise you then that a senior Department of Transport official has told me that he in fact feels that these inquiries always weighted very heavily towards the department because they can afford the expertise, the lawyers, the planners.
Yes. Well, I don't think I can discuss it anymore, really. I think it would be quite wrong for me to get involved in a discussion like this, especially at the beginning of the pretty important inquiry. Thank you very much, but I'd love to, but I must not take this any further.
Talk about it a bit further after the inquiry.
Well, maybe. I'd like to think about it. But I would welcome a discussion if I'm allowed to, and if it is the right thing to do. Now, that sounds pompous, but you know what I mean. I think there are other issues that are more important than my individual views.
Perhaps we could come back to the point.
Yes, sometime later on, perhaps. Okay. Is this all being taped? Oh, my God. Thank you very much.
Thank you. The inspector at an inquiry is appointed by the Secretaries of State for the Department of the Environment and the Department of Transport. In the middle 1970s, when inquiries were running into great difficulty, it was frequently observed that an inspector who was appointed by the people whose scheme he was inquiring into might not be completely impartial. And after a lot of difficulty at inquiries, the departments appeared to accept this criticism. There was an inquiry into inquiries. There was a review published of highway inquiry procedures, and it suggested that the answer was that the Lord Chancellor should nominate the inspector, who would still be appointed by the Secretaries of State. This turned out not to be a completely convincing answer to the criticism. After the change took place, I attempted to find out exactly how the how the inspector was nominated. It occurred to me that the Lord Chancellor is likely to be a busy man who won't have time to go into each individual nomination in great detail. So he must have assistants, and there must be a short list, and I tried to find out how this short list was drawn up, what criteria were used for selecting the names that appeared on it, and so on. Well, after a great deal of chasing around, I finally found myself talking to the person in the Lord Chancellor's office who claimed to be responsible for these matters. And I repeated my questions. How is this done? How is the short list drawn up? What criteria are used? And so on. And the answer came, it's an official secret. It then turned out that the person that I was talking to in the Lord Chancellor's office, who was responsible for these matters, was precisely the same person who had been responsible for these matters in the Department of Transport. And when the responsibility for nominating an inspector was transferred to the Lord Chancellor's office, so apparently were the bureaucrats who were doing all the work, who, in effect, were making the decision or making the larger part of the decision.
How are inspectors appointed for inquiries? Who decides who should be an inspector?
The Lord Chancellor.
And on whose recommendation?
Comes from his own office, as far as I'm aware. I'm not sure what the procedure is, but the Lord Chancellor has got a list of inspectors who are on what are called a panel, that is, of independent people who are prepared to act as inspectors, and he, or his staff, no doubt in the first case, select whom they think, or perhaps 2 or 3 people, for all I know, whom they think would be suitable to take on the inquiry, and the names are given to the Lord Chancellor for his confirmation.
Who actually puts the list together?
Well, his own staff.
On whose advice?
Well, as far as I know, I mean, I'm not in that machine. All I know is that somebody rings me up and says, would you be prepared to have your name put forward to the Lord Chancellor for such and such an inquiry? And that request comes from the Lord Chancellor's office.
So it's nothing to do with any of the governmental departments?
So far as I know, it comes from the Lord Chancellor's office. That's the only way I'm contacted, yes.
How did you get onto the list of people in the first place, do you know?
Yes, I had a letter asking me if I was interested from the Department of the Environment some years ago. I went up for an interview with the Lord Chancellor's office, and after that I decided that I would like to go on the list, and they decided that they would put me on the list.
Another difficulty is that still a great many inspectors have a history of road building in one form or another. They've spent their working lives as engineers or surveyors associated with major civil engineering projects of this nature. With a lifetime invested in projects of this sort, it occurs to some people that they might be that they might bring a set of attitudes toward the particular issue, which wouldn't necessarily view with sympathy the arguments of objectors to a road scheme. Now, this isn't to suggest in any way that the inspector is corrupt. It's not to attack his integrity in any way. The analogy that I use to explain my reservations about the procedures, I suggest that if the Pope were appointed to hear the arguments of an atheist against the existence of God and to write a report, you might get a report which was highly predictable. And I would suggest that in the prevailing climate, the objectors are cast in the role of atheists.
In your ideal world, how would you see the roads in London in, say, 20 years' time?
Well, I would like to feel that they are freer from congestion, that there is less noise and less fumes, and I believe that the situation is capable of being brought about by measures which are within our capability now. It would be an amalgam of sensible traffic planning measures, some major roadworks, such as the one I've mentioned being projected for the Archway area, and one or two projected and rather unique ideas, such as the one being floated by the Conservative Centre for Policy Studies, turning disused railway tracks or uneconomic railway tracks into express lorry routes or express coach routes.
Would you like to see more pedestrian subways?
Yes.
More railings to keep pedestrians away from crossing roads at different places?
I wouldn't very much like the idea of London particularly becoming more of a concrete and steel jungle than it is at the moment. But I think it is possible to design reasonably tasteful subways and reasonably unobtrusive safety measures to keep pedestrians more safe, yes.
But wouldn't you concede that it is environmentally much more pleasant to have goods moved by railways or by waterways than by some of the largest lorries that your members operate?
Not necessarily. Not if our proposals, our suggestions to government for a modern, up-to-date road system were accepted, and the Chancellor spent more money on the actual construction of roads than you could produce a road system in this country which is environmentally quite acceptable.
How many houses would you estimate would be demolished if that policy was enforced?
I wouldn't attempt to hazard a guess.
I think in Milton Keynes we're trying to actually build a city that is geared towards the future and does actually give people what they want. You don't have quite such a straightforward opportunity in all the older cities to do that. Although, of course, one of the main purposes of the new towns was to try and relieve pressure on the old cities so that they could be redeveloped along the lines of the sorts of environment that people want now. So I'm not saying that every city is going to look like Milton Keynes in 50 years' time, but I think we do provide some models for the future, yes.
And do you see more and more people getting cars and so on in the city?
Well, more and more people are getting cars nationally, although, of course, not nearly as quickly as people predicted in the late 60s. But I do believe that until such time as it becomes totally impossible, most people will aspire to having a personal form of transport.
A fusion of aerodynamic styling and advanced technology, the new Austin Maestro. Maestro has the versatility to offer the same interior space you'd expect to find in some larger cars. The HLE, using microchip technology to deliver 60 miles per gallon at 56 miles per hour. The Maestro Vanden Pla, linking luxury and refinement with technology.
Please fasten your seatbelt.
And now...
I think it's fairly clear that it's the increase in the use of the car that's caused the decline in public transport and not the other way around. But having said that, that leads to a fairly obvious political problem because very few politicians have an appetite for tackling the car. And I think the reason is fairly clear, because if you were to conduct a public opinion survey of all the people who don't have cars because they can't afford them, and if you were to ask them if they would like to have cars, I think overwhelmingly they would answer yes, because they would appreciate the enlargement of opportunities in life that would come with car ownership. And I think that's the implicit opinion survey to which politicians are responding. But if you were to ask another question, if you were to ask people if they would like to live in the sort of society in which everybody's wish came true, in which the country had achieved the saturation level of car ownership, and if you ask people if they would like to live in that sort of society, I think you would get quite a different answer. And if people found that a question which was a bit too abstract to answer, then you could take them to places where this has been achieved. You could take them to the Bronx or downtown Detroit and show them the sort of city that you get if you achieve the sorts of levels of car ownership that current government transport policy in this country aspire to. And if you showed people that, which seems to me to be the obvious consequence of pursuing the current transport policies, and asked them if that was the sort of society that they would like to live in, I think you'd get a very different answer.
Les films de Jean-Luc Godard.
Close quote. This is Susan DeWitt reporting from Paris for the American Broadcasting System.